Hello everyone, it is Joe here from OmniPoke, the channel that brings you guys everything Pokemon. If you're looking for PTCGO codes, including the Rebel Clash stuff, go ahead and check out the Potown store. You can get a 5% discount on your orders using that code OmniPoke. For today's video, we are going to be looking at the top 8 deck lists of the Qualifier 3 of the Limitless tournament. There is just one more to go. That is going to be on the 30th and 31st of May. And then it's down to the Invitational itself. And yeah, we'll end up with 16 players competing for really top prizes. But this was the first ever tournament that we had to look at with Ultra Prism-Rebel Clash. The new set coming out, seeing how powerful Dragapult can be, boss's orders, how that impacts the game, and all these sorts of things. So lots to talk about here. You can see the breakdown of top 8 is very interesting indeed. There are 4 PikaRom in the top 8, so 50%, which is crazy. 2 Dragapults, the new hyped archetype from Rebel Clash, didn't disappoint. There was a Mill as well as a non-GX Baby Blounds in the list, and seeing no Zacian decks at all. No Turbo Zacian, no Luke Metal, no ADP, and no Mewtwo either. So yeah, really incredible stuff. Before I jump into these top 8 lists, we will have a nice breakdown here. That's why you're seeing my face on this side of the screen, so I could fit in the amount of PikaRom that we had on this slide. This is a Complexity Card Gaming graph. Go ahead and check us out on Facebook. And you can see here the full extent of PikaRom's dominance, really. It was a very popular deck in day one, and it converted pretty decently as well. 27% of the almost 150 decks you can see here that made day 2 were PikaRom players. Baby Blacephalon being the second most prevalent. ADP Zacian was there, it just didn't quite convert as well as we've previously come to see. A couple of different Dragapult decks kind of combined to do pretty well as well. So there was Malamar, mostly with scoop ups, and there are more sort of straight Dragapult lists. The 2 that we saw in the top 8 were both straight Pult lists, which is interesting, and we'll get onto that later. ADP Tomb, Turbo Zacian, the Mr. Mime Jirachi Prism combo. That was kind of the deck that I was championing, and I know a lot of people were trying it out, seeing if it was fun or actually good or whatever. But it did have a handful of people make it in, which is cool. Obstagoon, kind of interestingly enough, remained decent. I think for the most part, it's either trying to dodge Dragapult or tech new cards into to beat that matchup. Obviously, Yveltal GX helps out a lot, but also having energy acceleration options to turbo out Sableye, or at least putting Sableye back in the list at the absolute minimum to improve that Dragapult matchup. Did okay. Mewtwo obviously dropping down the tier list because of the new awkward Dragapult matchup. Also, things like Baby Blounds remaining in the format being just a bit of a headache at times. Mewtwo did well in the previous qualifier, but that got caught in a perfect storm of being able to Big Charm Swell against ADP Zacian, which was super popular, and Stinger Baby Blound against Mill, which was super popular. That's where we're going on to next, because Mill was basically nowhere. There was 3 Zacian control decks. You can see a tiny slither of the pie chart there, just over here, which is absolutely crazy. We also see some Luke Metal Zacian, Firebox, Rillaboom, all these sorts of ones, and then we have a big other category. Basically, a bunch of other VMAX decks kind of like crept in places. Toxtricity, Cinderace, Inteleon, they all featured. We saw an interesting Stage 2 Luxray deck. Obviously, the Luxio has item lock capabilities. The Luxray has 160 for 1, I think. We saw some Frostmoth stuff. We saw an Excadrill Zeb Striker as well. Maybe it was someone capitalizing on the PikaRom hype, as well as being like decent at trading 1 prize for 1 prize against things like Baby Blounds. So maybe that's something to explore as well. Overall, really diverse meta, and not too surprising seeing things like PikaRom and Baby Blacephalon do well. Obviously, ADP didn't make the top 8, but it still remained a factor for sure. I think for me, I was most surprised by the other Zacian builds doing a little bit worse than I predicted, really. I was expecting quite a few people to jump off the ADP train onto different builds, and I think I'm a little bit surprised at how few control decks adapted. I think going into Qualifier 4, Mill is actually pretty well poised, because if PikaRom and Baby Blounds are increasing in popularity, ADP Zacian possibly decreasing, could be really good for Mill. You can just tech heavier for the Dragapult matchup and you seem to be better off. So that's just a quick initial thoughts, but let's jump into the most successful lists now from the tournament of the weekend. And it was Kim Pobega from Italy who was able to take the tournament down with his PikaRom list. We're going to be looking at all the different variations of PikaRom, and I think the biggest surprise here is we see the Tag Call package come back. I think most people assumed with Speed, Light, Energy entering the formats that more people would just go even more turbo and just say that drawing 2 extra cards helps you towards full blitz enough. But we're seeing the Tag Call package get back into this list, and it's actually kind of similar to the concept I thought about ADPization adding in a mini Tag Call package once again after going towards Acrobike and Spinner for a while, and it's really because the power of Malolana is much stronger right now. So I think that's a mini, like, a main factor why we saw the Tag Call list become relevant, and that's because Malolana is a much stronger card in the meta, good in Mirror Match, and also good against Dragapult, which is obviously a big deal. So yeah, I think Malolana, certainly an interesting one-of, and does wrap in the Tag Call package that little bit easier. And let's still be frank, being able to Guzhala whenever you are the player going first, you can guarantee that full blitz on turn 2 very, very easily by just Guzhalaing for your mountain. Speed, Lightning, Energy give you additional draw cards, so that's also pretty sweet. Other than that, we're seeing a couple copies of Bolton V. I think you'll notice from the top 8, most players are between 1 and 2 copies, so much more than just a tech one-of. Sometimes it's completely pushing out Coco V as expected. Some people are actually playing both Bolton and Coco. But in general, it's interesting to see a mix of, you know, a decent amount of 2 prizes in addition to a decent amount of 3 prizes, so you can play different game plans against whatever deck you're expecting. So it is interesting that you do have the option with, you know, Zeraora double Boltoned to try and go just the 2 prize route only if you are up against, you know, things like Baby Blounds and such, where you don't need to reach a like high damage ceiling, but you don't also want to throw your opponent those easy 3 prize knockouts. So something to bear in mind for sure. Other than that, we're seeing a really high count of Boss's Orders, 3 copies, as well as the Great Catcher. I think most people would have expected a 2 count. Especially with Eldegoss as well. This is like a really, really high count. It's actually the same count that Jack played in his PikaRom list this weekend. So both seeing value in that. Only really other notes here is that this is still choosing to play Tag Switch, even though it's not playing Volkner. It's playing 1 reset stamp again, no Volkner. A lot of these cards you just have to draw into at the right time. So there is a bit of question mark around those when you don't have quite the same synergy you'd expect with other lists to be able to play these sorts of one-offs and get away with it, but that just happens to be the case. And the other thing to bear in mind is that there are no Jirachi in this list whatsoever. There are Jirachi lists that do make the top 8, but for the most part, it's the Tag Call package that sort of comes in over, I think, a little bit of the Jirachi package. So yeah, just a small thing to bear in mind. But yeah, overall, pretty interesting Tag Call based list of PikaRom. Who knows if that's going to be the most popular going forward, or if it will be any of these others. Regardless, Kim was able to win in the finals against Justin, who was also playing PikaRom. And we'll have a quick look at this 60 in comparison. Again, you're seeing this is where we do see that Tapu Koko V as well as the double Bolton. So lots of 2 prize options if you do want to go down that route. And still seeing the value of Coco V, possibly because of how good it is at dealing with Zacians. Maybe there's just an expectation that Zacian was still going to be a really popular deck, and I think PikaRom, outside of its big GX attack turn, can sometimes struggle at getting over the line against them. Coco V is a great card that can sort of checkmate some Zacian players, especially seeing as though a lot of ADP Zacians have moved away from Absol and Reset Stamp as they've become weaker in the meta. PikaRom can just get ahead, stay ahead against a lot of ADP players with that Coco V involved. So not too surprising to still see it be in the deck, but a lot of people have just gone towards the double Bolton instead. We've got that Eldegoss once again. We are seeing a more traditional support account here in the Volkners at the research and a couple copies of Boss with that 1 Great Catcher and Eldegoss to try and give yourself plenty of different options to Gust. It's got the double Stamp, the double Big Charm, a much lower energy count than I've seen in a lot of other PikaRoms. I think this is definitely the lowest we've seen. Kim was playing 14, a 10 and 4 split. Here we're seeing a 3-9 split, very, very thin on the ground, so you really have to be careful about where you are committing your energies throughout the game with this list. You do have that tag switch to give you a bit more flexibility alongside Volkner synergy, so there is that going for it. But otherwise, a pretty cookie-cutter PikaRom list. It's interesting to see that more people are going towards like a higher Bolton count than they are going for a couple Jirachis to help skew the amount of optimal starts that you have in the deck. I think this might be a reaction to Dragapult. Obviously, PikaRom doesn't really have space to play scoop up nets, and if you are putting down Jirachis or happening to start Jirachi against Dragapult, it can be a bit of an issue. So more people are opting to have just higher raw hit points on the board to make things more awkward for people. So there's kind of two camps of PikaRom right now. It's going to be like Jirachi-less and then people just playing Jirachi. I think the other two 60s that we see in the top 8 are playing at least some copies of Jirachi. My own personal list of PikaRom was playing just 2 copies and no escape boards, or sometimes 1 escape board. So it was kind of like the 50-50. Whenever you're not against Dragapult, you get to put it down freely, but if you are against Pult, you just sort of bin them. So maybe that's something that we could see going forward. Personally, I do like having just extra basics that aren't Eldegoss and aren't Dedenne, and also you don't even really want to start PikaRom all that often because you'd rather it be on the bench. So it's cool to see non-Jirachi based builds still try and offset that and have optimal leads all over the place with the Boltons and the Coco and stuff like that. So just a quick thing to bear in mind as well, but not too much else there. We see a top 4 list from James from the Philippines, and he is playing the straight Dragapult list, which is very cool. Piloting this to a very decent finish. Not too surprising here in terms of just being, that Dragapult VMAX line that we've come to expect. It's got Jirachi for support. It's got just double Zigzagoon and no copies of Distortion Door in here. Personally, I'm a bigger fan of 1-1, but it's just what it is. We're seeing that 1 Dedenne, a usual count as well. We're seeing the Giratina with the Enhanced Hammer effect for the opponent's active. This is a decent card for mirror matches. The amount of PikaRom playing quad Speed Lightning is really high as well right now. So yeah, it certainly gets a decent amount of value. It's also playing Shadowbox Mimikyu, which is quite interesting. If I was to think of anything that it's a tech for, I would say Baby Blacephalon, because you can put a damage counter on Oricorio and stop them getting hand value, which is interesting. I can't think of much else where it's great. Like, I don't expect Mewtwo to be that hard of a matchup, but I guess maybe it can help cover you against maybe some Ultimate Mewtwo or something like that, but not really too sure. It is playing the Scoop Up Block Mr. Mime, so expecting some mirror matches, I would imagine. And also stopping people using Scoop Up Net on Jirachis after you've pinged them down, so you can play with a lot more confidence of where you're putting your spread and mapping out your prizes, which is pretty interesting. It's playing the Fiona in addition to Double Boss. I really do like that include, but I think the real biggest thing to note here is that it's playing 3 copies of Giant Bomb. Giant Bomb was one of these cards that I initially... It was like one of the first cards I took out of my Dragapult because I thought it was pretty niche, but I think it certainly can help you in a lot of ways. It can offset times where people just blow up a Dragapult and sweep you from then on, because you're at least getting a lot of damage into play for you to deal with immediately with a Dragapult, and you just sort of don't get just completely board wiped. Also, when you're up against things like Baby Blounds, I'll go back to that sort of deck, and obviously they're trying to go over the top of you a lot of the time. You can make some cool Fiona plays, take multiple knockouts all at once. Or you can even just like prod with just a regular Dragapult V and then try and get into a VMAX like later on in the game. So they take a VMAX knockout, a V knockout, and then another VMAX knockout. So you can make some interesting plays there with the Giant Bomb, which is pretty interesting. We're seeing the double Chaotic Swell. I think it's very solid against controlling players as well as PikaRom to put those in early on in the game. And it's playing spinners rather than... sometimes you see a 10 counter Psychics. Personally, I was on Acrobikes, but Spinner's still absolutely fine as well. So yeah, pretty solid baseline of Dragapult going forward. Can't think of much changing. I still believe Mr. Mime is like a valid include for sure. The Mimikyu, potentially not all that valid. I have to test out the Baby Blounds matchup more to see how reliable this is and how helpful it is. Obviously, trying to smash Marnies at them, trying to deny them from putting Jirachis into play, all plays into your favour as Dragapult. So if you're also shutting down the Oricorio, it is additional help. So things to bear in mind for sure. The tech options really aren't here. I guess Wobbuffet would be the only one that I'd be expecting to help out against the PikaRom influx in future. So yeah, potentially space might be made to improve the PikaRom by adding in the Wobbuffet, but not too much else to be said there. There will be another Dragapult list that we get to look at as well. So Wilma Johansson was able to also make top 4 with Control. And a lot of people have written off Control for the tournament. I was pleading with people to not ignore this archetype. It just still has way too many tools at its disposal. And we basically saw a small adaptation from a regular core of Cincino and Zacian and Oranguru to adding in more of the handlock package, which I think is interesting. We've gone back to a couple of Jirachis. We've gone back to Articuno Water Energy. And we've added in the Mars, the Stamp, the Chip to handlock people and really just buy yourself free turns toward that late game against archetypes where you can't just rely on them not having enough outs to beat you. So yeah, really interesting build. It's got the 4 Yell as well as 4 Crushings. So again, trying to deny that early ADP GX, trying to deny the 1 attachment per turn Dragapults. Which is pretty interesting. It's still playing the 4 Lily Pokédoll. I think a lot of the Japanese Control players completely cut Doll from their list altogether and just went for either Jirachis or things like Goomies and those sorts of Pokemon. So still repping the Dolls, forcing things out of like Baby Blounds, for example, PikaRom. These decks that don't always have enough bosses orders to get through the game. Doll still forces outs, and when you are playing the mini handlock package, it can be a little bit awkward for them, so something to bear in mind. Obviously, it is playing the double Sky Pillar in here. That was obviously an include that I think most Control lists were forced to go towards to try and protect their board against Dragapult, but beyond that, we're still seeing Mill successful. It's worked in a few spaces. I'm personally not sure how strong I think the Chip is, because I still expect a lot of Oranguru in lists. I still expect Zacian to be a tech card in a lot of different decks, so I don't know how much to lean into the handlock package. I'd certainly like having Stamp in here, though. Stamp seems definitely very good, and Surge and Mars are obviously like reasonable cards as well. I also like the Articuno over the Magcargo GX Mewtwo package because it's just too difficult for Control to be like ignoring the opponent these days, because they can win too quickly if you just let them have their game plan and you're just trying to aggro mill their deck. So I do like a shift of focus towards the Control style here. A bit of interaction is always good in the game. So yeah, it's cool to see Mill still be decent. And I think, like I said, because it's completely off the map here, basically, I would expect it to have a small resurgence in Q4. So definitely don't just take the sack to that deck. I think it's not that wise. Alexis comes in with Baby Blacephalon, the highest placing player. And basically it is a cookie cutter Baby Blounds list with no new additions other than Scoop Up Net, and we're seeing the additions of Mewtwo and Zigzagoon. Those are really the only big changes compared to previous lists. It's eaten slightly into the Switch and Escape board counts. I think that's really all we're seeing. Not too much else here that I'm surprised by. Not playing any Victini Prism Star, so pretty weak against the controlling decks. But other than that, I think you're pretty reasonable against more or less everything. So yeah, not playing any Lucky Egg either. But yeah, I think those are all kind of the fringe cards anyway, so not a big deal to adding the Scoop Up Nets, the Zigzagoon and stuff like that. Personally, I'm not a big fan of the Zigzagoon. I know a lot of people say like, oh, it's one less fire energy that you need here and there, as I get a random follow on Twitch. But it's like, fire energy is way more searchable in Blounds than a Zigzagoon, because normally you're spending your ball search on other things. Scoop Up Net is like reasonable for just more Stellar Wishes in general, and obviously you have that synergy with Mewtwo, so I can see why Zigzagoon's in here, but I'm not actually a big fan of it personally. Like, if it was me, I would probably cut the Scoop Up Net count actually lower, maybe have like 2 copies and then have the Mewtwo in there, and actually cut away from the Zigzagoon, and just go back to more core essential cards, because I'm always an absolute pansy when I play Blounds. I am terrified of getting just like a lone basic and getting donked and stuff, so I'm absolutely terrified about the number of cards you have in the early game that just make you brick and die. And Scoop Up Net actually counts as those most of the time. Even if you do have like multiple Jirachis and stuff, it's only in those situations where Scoop Up Net's alive in the early game. They're pretty much dead every other time. And even if you have like Jirachi and a random Pokemon, some of these Pokemon have a 2 retreat cost, like Victini, Blacephalon GX, Baby Blacephalon, Zacian, Mewtwo. These all have 2 retreat costs, so you can't just like Scoop Up Net Jirachi, pay a retreat, get back into Jirachi. It's like really, really difficult to make it work. So I personally would eat into this scoop up net count going forward. Now, is it helpful against Dragapult? Obviously, it means they have to play a lot smarter around like knocking out multiple things at once, and you can undo some damage that way. So there is that argument for scoop up net. But personally, I think Blounds is like just okay against Dragapult no matter what. Sometimes, especially if people are going towards the one attachment a turn build, you can just completely blow them up with early tempo. And yeah, so I think we can still see some Blounds with no scoop up whatsoever, but if you do want to take on this sort of list, I would still choose to eat into the Zigzagoon count, eat into one or two of these scoop up nets instead, and gain back some consistency slots. That's my own personal opinion, but at the end of the day, the scoop up nets done them pretty well overall. Then for the top 8, we have Lyda Iverson with PikaRom. I believe he tweeted that this was the list that Tord helped him with. Either it's Tord 60 or some sort of combination of the two. Very interesting, though. It's playing 16 energy cards. So we saw in the top 8 there was a list that played as low as 12 total, a mix of speed and basic energies. But here we're seeing 16 copies of energy cards. And I thought 14 was pretty high, but yeah, this has gone all in on that sort of approach, making sure that you have plenty to throw away with those early radars, the early quick balls. I love Quad Radar. I think it's such an important card in PikaRom. I do like the choice to, even with 16 energy cards, the choice to say, yes, Quick Ball Radar, they are too important to say no to. Just give me my Dedenne outs, let me get zooming off. Very, very cool from there. The Pokemon line, pretty interesting that we're seeing, again, the double Boltund, but that's really about it. For the exciting Pokemon, playing the one copy of Jirachi with no escape board. I think this is like the least committal you can be, but still have the option to plant him on board whenever you want to. Either you can Lightning Ride into him if you need to, or you can just have him as that last-ditch effort to get yourself out of a reset stamp on your opponent's side. So I still think Jirachi is too good of a card to say no to in a lot of situations. So I like having one, potentially two in the list, but that's really about it. And again, we're seeing that same reflection of a high boss's orders being the best way to play it. 3 copies with that Eldegoss V being really solid here. We're also seeing 1 copy of Malolana. So yeah, that seems to be the new shell of PikaRom supporter-wise. Choosing to just play 2 Volkner, 3 Research. You can see the tilt towards the Dedenne usage is the way they've gone about this for consistency. Obviously playing 16 energy means that you do cut away from the Researchers and Volkners a little bit as well. But yeah, it is leaning more towards let me Dedenne on turn 1 for the love of God, because it's going to help me get that full blitz, and that's what it's all about at the end of the day. So yeah, interesting to see all sorts of different lists of PikaRom. It's still down to personal preference by the looks of things, and I think it really just shows that the core of PikaRom is just so strong, because we've seen 3 vastly different lists. We've seen a Tag Call, we've seen a list that plays 4 Research, 4 Volkner, and 12 Energy, and now we've seen 3 Research, 2 Volkner, 1 Malolana, and like just Dedenne usage instead. Dennis is the final PikaRom player. And again, we're seeing a few differences here. It's got 13 energy, so we still can't decide on that overall. This list is playing a couple Marnies in the list in addition to double reset stamp, so maybe trying to be more proactive against the Baby Blounds player. Obviously, if you are playing Marnie, you do probably have to play Jirachi on your own end so that you don't just ruin yourself. So that's why we're seeing Marnie only exactly in this list, because it's playing a higher Jirachi count. It's also got that Marshadow in here, so you can bounce Swell. I think that's important going forward, seeing as though Dragapult, one of the highest placing Pults, was playing double Swell, so definitely something to bear in mind. Other than that, again, just a pretty normal shell, I would say, overall. Most of these PikaRoms are only playing 1 copy of Big Charm, which I find a little bit interesting. But I guess Scrap It is more of a factor in the game now, and more often than not, it goes on exactly your first PikaRom and like nothing else, so I can see why people are trying to buy that space and just have the 1 Big Charm. And I mean, when you're not up against ADPization, that Big Charm's not actually all that important, so it could even be flexible from there, it could be removed, although Big Charm's still good in Mirror. Hard to say. So yeah, maybe cut to the 1 count is the way to go. We'll see though. And finally, we will have Haruki's list from Japan. So obviously a lot of the Japanese player base have had a bit more time to test with these cards. They may have even played in tournaments before lockdown with some Rebel Clash stuff. So yeah, we're seeing Dragapult here. A very similar Pokemon line to the list we saw in top 4 as well. This time it is playing an Oranguru to pop off with the Mewtwo. Not much else to say there. The Scoop Up Block Mime seems to be a really important tech for this tournament. You did see a decent number as we flick back to this one of the Malipults. And Malipult without Scoop Up Block Mime is super favored against this Mali build, I would say. So yeah, the Scoop Up Block certainly an important card here. We're seeing that double Yell Grunt, double Malolana, double Boss all in the list, which is very interesting. Kind of just reminds me of that list we saw from Yaneda, I think it was. So yeah, sticking with that sort of mentality, just having the 2 of all of those is interesting. It's got 1 Reset Stamp, 1 Giant Bomb, 1 Power Plant as the only stadium in the entire deck, so can potentially be punished by some control players who are using Sky Pillar, maybe even some ADP Tomb players who try Sky Pillar out. So one thing that I'd be slightly concerned about would just be the 1 Power Plant, but Power Plant in general could be a really, really strong card going forward. Again, if PikaRom is more and more hyped, having 2, even 3 Power Plant, stopping their push potential in the late game when they're digging for E-powers or digging for ways around your Dragapult can be very, very detrimental to them. So, yeah, I can see Power Plant being a decent include in Dragapult because you're not all that reliant on your own Dedenne very often. And yeah, it can be a nice counter stadium to most things. And basically nothing is playing Power Plant right now. So, yeah, it could be a nice include for sure. Maybe alongside 1 Swell. Maybe just like a high Power Plant count if you want to. But yeah, pretty interesting to see a really, really thick supporter line here, actually. Normally you see like 1 counts of the Malolana. Sometimes you see just 3 copies of Marnie and a bigger lean towards maybe Acrobikes, maybe Spinners that we saw, maybe Viridians and stuff like that. But instead it's just playing a high physical energy count. Make sure you don't whiff every turn. And yeah, just that 1 stadium. For me, I would probably go down to 10 energy and just throw in a Viridian immediately because you're deck thinning and you're competing with Stadium War that much more often. But that's a personal thing. You can do whatever you want. But yeah, just another solid core of straight Pult. It seems like the Mr. Mime was the key tech for that going forward. So yeah, that is the top 8, guys. I'll give you one last look at the pie chart as well. Like I said, I think going forward, it's not that PikaRom and Blounds aren't good going forward. I just do think they have to be a little bit aware of things like Obstagoon potentially rising back up, potentially Mill coming back into the meta. Dragapult adapting its tech cards in some ways could be interesting. I do imagine there will still be a good amount of ADP Zacian and other Zacian builds going forward. Zacian is kind of kept in check by Baby Blounds, but I do still believe that ADP Zacian with a Mew is still pretty decent against PikaRom. Maybe things have changed since the last time I've tested that matchup like a huge amount. But maybe ADP Zacian goes back to its own tag call package and adds those reset stamps back in. I think those could all be interesting, especially if PikaRom is moving away from Jirachi. You can certainly punish them that way. So let me know your thoughts down below. How did you do in this tournament? Jack is going to be uploading, or already has started uploading actually, some of his games of the tournament. I personally wasn't playing. I've got a lot going on right now. I don't have a huge amount of excuses. I am also not super motivated to play right now, but I'm trying to get back into the swing of things. I'm probably going to be playing Q4, but don't quote me on it. So yeah, that's it for today, guys. Hope you did enjoy, and I'll be back with more videos on the channel tomorrow. Cheers.